When's that new ink getting here? Oh, Jenny, do you really have to go out right now? Do you really have to go out right now? I'm waiting on something. Okay. David here with Figboot on Pens, back again with another ink review. Today I have for you a brand new ink from Papier Plume, and that ink is called 11. Well, first of all, wanted to thank Papier Plume for providing this ink for review, and later on I'll let you know how you can pick up your own bottle. There are three different themes which collide with this ink. First of all, it's being released on November 2nd to celebrate Fountain Pen Day, which always falls on the first Friday in November. Secondly, the ink is named 11, and that's because it's the 11th anniversary of Papier Plume's retail location in New Orleans. And finally, the ink is also themed around the television show Stranger Things. One of the main characters of that show is named 11. And as you'll see in a bit, the bottle is pretty neat as well. So in order to take a closer look at this cool new offering from Papier Plume, let's go over here to camera 2. Okay, let's start off by taking a look at this pretty cool bottle. So the ink is named 11, so as you can see there's a big 11 on top. There's also an 11 on the side, and it says 11-year anniversary fountain pen ink from Papier Plume. And then you can see here that Papier Plume is written in the front in the Stranger Things font, and it's also in celebration of Fountain Pen Day here in 2018. And then also, which I think is kind of cool, is typically the Papier Plume inks have this, the wax that's dripped on the cap, but in this case it is dripped on the bottom to represent the upside down, which is a place in the Stranger Things show. If you watch the show, you're very familiar with the upside down. So that's what that represents. And the drips going up, I think, are pretty cool. And in regard to the ink itself, this is what the color looks like. It's kind of a reddish brown, and it's something along the lines of like a diamine ancient copper. Here's what it looks like in regard to the Franklin Christoph Terra Firma. It's not quite as red as that. It's not quite as red as the Bungbox Piano Mahogany, or even it's a little bit redder than something like the Conway Stewart King Sand. And this is what the ink looks like on some Tomoe River paper. This is a very heavy application of ink right here, and then this is more of just a cotton tip or Q-tip swab. And you can see here that there was quite a bit of it bleed through in regard to the heavier application. Not much in regard to the swab, but this, I really put a heavy amount on here, so any type of bleed through there is to be understood. And here we go with Papier Plume 11. This top here, I wrote with the Pilot Parallel pen. It's a 2.4 millimeter. This is a really good pen to practice calligraphy on. It has a nice wide nib to it. This is a Rhodey 80-gram paper. I'd say that this pen, or this ink rather, has low ghosting and low bleed. You could tell here on the Rhodia paper there is virtually no bleed, or there's no ghosting and bleed at all on this Rhodia paper. I'd say that the shade is medium. You do get a little bit of shade in here, and that especially here, I did notice on this swab right here that around the edges, it really gets a little bit darker when on some heavier applications. So you can get a little bit of shading on there. And I'd say that the sheen is rather low on this ink. The pens that I'm using here today, the first one here is this Livin' You Shiyu. This is a pen from China that I'll have to be taking a look at here in the somewhat near future that is very cool. I just think the acrylics on this pen are amazing, and it's very reasonably priced as well. And then for a medium nib, I have a classic Mont Blanc 146. And then for kind of my broader nib, I'm cheating a little bit, I guess, because this is a Pelican M-1000, and they call it a fine nib, but this fine nib is, essentially broader than, a double broad or something like that. It's a very broad nib in regard to standard nib sizes, but it's what Pelican calls their fine. That if you're not familiar with Stranger Things, it is a science fiction horror television series which airs on Netflix. It's set in a fictional small town in rural Indiana in the 1980s. It has a lot of interesting characters and great writing, and offers up a lot of 1980s nostalgia. As someone who was a teenager in the 80s, I can relate to a lot of what's going on in the show. And for the writing sample, I wanted to offer up some short quotes from the Stranger Things characters. So first of all, with the Livin' You, we have "Mornings are for coffee and contemplation," which is a quote from Chief of Police Jim Hopper, who basically whose diet consists of coffee and cigarettes. Now for the medium pen, the Mont Blanc 149. And science is neat, but I'm afraid it's not very forgiving, which is a quote from the kids, one of their favorite teachers, Mr. Clark. And then finally, for the larger nib, this Pelican M-1000, it's a quote from Jonathan Byers, who's one of the older teenagers in the show, and he says that nobody normal ever accomplished anything meaningful in this world. So if you feel like a freak, then chances are you're probably doing things right. So I'd say that the flow of this pen is rather wet. In regard to the drying time, for a fine nib, it took up to 15 seconds before it really dried, and for a medium nib, it took 30 seconds, or a little bit over 30 seconds before it was fully dry. I would say here that with heavier applications, the ink can have some rather dark edges to it, as we saw in the swatch. And that I said that Papier Plume 11 is a fun color with fun themes. And I'm kind of a sucker for a good theme when it comes to a pen or an ink. So this ink has a lot going for it. Now this is important, that 11 will be available at the Ohio Pen Show this upcoming weekend, and it will be available to purchase on the Papier Plume site beginning on November 2nd. There will be very limited quantities available. So I would strongly suggest, if you would like to pick up this ink, that you try to hit their site up on the 2nd, because my guess is it's not going to last very long. So in regard to a water test, let's go ahead and put some water on here. And we'll let that sit for a second. And as we let it sit, let's take a look at some chromatography. And you can see here that once it starts to separate, it kind of separates into kind of a light gray, and then it goes into some yellows and some oranges, and then some reds and browns. So this is what it ended up looking like after a while, and a nice big stretch of kind of gray right here, and you can see where then it shades into the yellows and oranges and reds, and then some darker colors at the end. So I think doing chromatography like this is kind of cool. Okay, let's see what we ended up with for the water test. That you can see that it's not necessarily waterproof, that especially on the edges here, that all of the brown went away and everything that was left was this grayish color here. So this grayish color here had a little bit more staying power than the rest of things. So in the end, I really like this ink. I feel that it performs well and it's decent overall. And I really love the theme and the bottle. I don't feel that Papier Plume is going to have any problems whatsoever blowing through their limited inventory. So if you're lucky enough to get your hands on one of these, you should feel fortunate. So until next time, thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you later.